Yeah, I'm Dafydd Elias, and from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology here in Lancaster. And today I'm going to be talking about an EPSRC funded project. And this was in collaboration between ourselves and Crops for the Future in Malaysia. And this was looking at the potential to use locally produced biochar from locally grown bioenergy crops in order to improve the productivity and remediate degraded soils in Southeast Asia. So this was a very small-scale, quick 6-month project, and it was kind of pump priming in order to kind of develop a collaboration between ourselves and CFF for kind of future work. So, very briefly, biochar is a carbon-rich solid produced by pyrolyzing biomass. And when applied to soil, has been associated with a number of beneficial properties. So, a number of studies have shown reductions in nutrient leaching and soil acidity with increases in soil fertility and cation exchange capacity, increase in water retention, and then it's also found utility in contaminated land for land remediation. And ultimately, in many studies, they've shown increases in crop yields. And then it also has a climate mitigation angle, so this carbon is far more stable than the biomass from which it was derived. And so when added to soil, it's thought to persist for centuries to millennia. So it has a long-term carbon sequestration benefit. And then also it's been associated with reduced fertilizer-associated nitrous oxide emissions in particular. However, a recent meta-analysis of a number of 150 studies looking at biochar found that, in fact, many of these beneficial effects, it was very case specific, and in tropical soils with low pH and low nutrients, these benefits were concentrated, whereas in temperate soils, there was actually no real benefit on crop yields. So with this in mind, we came up with this concept of growing biomass crops on idle or marginal land, which is widespread across this region. So a leucaena, which is a very fast-growing end-fixing tree, or Napier grass, which is kind of elephant grass. Both of these are drought-tolerant and very, very high yielding. And then using this biomass and feeding it into a gasifier system to produce biochar, and then also a small amount of syngas, which is produced at the same time, which can be used to meet domestic energy needs. And then the biochar is added to agricultural systems in order to hopefully enhance yields and remediate soils. So for the purposes of this kind of small-scale, quick experiment, we chose amaranthus as a crop to focus on, which is a leafy spinach-like vegetable which is grown widely across this region. But most importantly for us is it went from seed to maturity in just 35 days, so it was kind of ideal for our purposes. So really the question here was, can this locally produced biochar remediate degraded soils and enhance their productivity in tropical agro-ecosystems? So we designed a pot experiment and we chose 3 soil types, low, medium and high fertility, and then we imposed 2 biochar treatments, so one with no biochar and then one with a standard application of 30 tonnes per hectare. And then in combination with these, we added 2 fertilizer treatments, so one without, and then one just following the commercial best practice guidelines for the area, which was a combination of NPK and chicken manure. And then we repeated this experiment over 2 growth cycles. So at the end of the first growth cycle, we replanted on those same soils and we reapplied fertilizer. At the end of each growth cycle, we measured the dry weight of above ground biomass, which gave us our yield. And then at the same time, we also looked at below ground biomass and measured soil pH. And then we also measured soil nutrient availability using ion exchange membranes, which we buried in situ in the soil. And they give you kind of an indicator of nutrients that are available for plant uptake. So this is kind of what it looked like. We did this out in Malaysia in semi-controlled environment in an open polytunnel. We standardized soil moistures across all of these, and then we used a drip feed irrigation system in order to maintain these throughout the experiment. So this is what the crop looked like after 35 days, just before harvest. So first of all, we looked at the response of yield to biochar addition. So here in the green-blue, we've got the low fertility soil, in the yellow medium, and then in the red high. And then we've got the 2 growth cycles stacked one on top of each other. And on the left-hand side, we have fertilized pots. On the right-hand side, we've got non-fertilized. And then in both cases, the pairwise comparisons are with biochar and then without biochar on the right-hand side. So what we saw was around 15 to 20% increase in yield with biochar addition in combination with fertilizer, but only in the lowest fertility soils. And we didn't see any response in the medium and the high. But then this was not persistent into the second growth cycle. So not only did we not see a biochar effect, but we also saw a 30 to 40% reduction in yield. In the non-fertilized pots, we see the same general trend across all soil types and across growth cycle 1 and 2. And we generally see an increase in yield with biochar addition. However, the yields were quite poor. They were less than half of what we achieved with fertilizer. We then looked at the effect on soil pH. So the pH of our biochar was around 9, and so unsurprisingly, it had a liming effect with or without fertilizer on all of our soils. But interestingly, even without biochar addition, just with our fertilizer application, we saw a liming, and that's probably because of our use of chicken manure, which tends to have neutral to moderately alkaline pH, depending on the diet of the poultry. And so that may explain why we didn't see a great response to biochar addition, because a liming effect is one of the main mechanisms with which biochar has been proposed as having these yield benefits. So then lastly, we looked at the effect of biochar on soil nutrient availability, and this is just for the unfertilized pots only. So in the absence of any added nutrients, we saw increase in inorganic N, phosphorus, and particularly base cations. And so phosphorus and base cations probably interacting with increase in soil pH. But in the case of inorganic N, which is less pH dependent, that indicates that we've added some labile nitrogen compounds, which was incorporated within the biochar itself. So in summary, in combination with fertilizer, our biochar appeared to increase yield in the lowest nutrient, most acidic soils. However, we didn't see this effect persist into the second growth cycle. And the reason why is we think that we added nutrients in excess. So I didn't show this on the previous slide, but in our fertilized pots, from growth cycle 1 to 2, we saw a 4-fold increase in the amount of available NP and cations. So we think the recommendations that we were given were just far too high. Without fertilizer, yields were poor. However, we did see a general increase across all soil types, which may be associated with the increase in nutrient availability and cation exchange capacity that we observed. And so, all in all, this suggests that this biochar may be useful to maintain yields whilst reducing fertilizer demand. And so now, using this initial data, we're beginning to design some follow-on experiments looking at different fertilizers and different rates of application to see whether we can maintain yields whilst reducing the amount used. So all that remains is just to say thank you to our collaborators over at Crops for the Future for running this experiment in our absence, and also EPSRC and Supergen Bioenergy Hub for their funding support. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, well done.
Thank you.
Water. Time for a couple of questions, if there are any. I have one that comes to mind, that's about whether you consider the economics behind all of this, particularly when you're talking about sort of reducing the need or reducing the fertilizer demand.
Yeah.
So the cost of the fertilizer versus the cost of actually producing the biochar and adding the biochar.
Yeah.
And also then considered the performance of the biochar, for example, versus just applying the residues into the system rather than actually going through all that pyrolysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, one way to kind of build upon this experiment is to use some kind of positive control where you just add the raw biomass in its raw form, unpyrolysed, and that'd really be able to, you'd be able to tease out the effect of that pyrolysis of the biomass itself. In terms of the economics, there is a question of, if just the increase in pH in these acidic soils is the main driver, then maybe it's more economic to apply lime. But if this biochar is produced locally on land which is not in production anyway, along with all of the other benefits that it may provide, there are reasons why you would choose to do that over simply applying lime.
Okay, I'll go.
Sorry, just to add, we also saw a very similar pattern in some Malaysian soils with biochar. But I think one of the benefits with the lime is when I start to think of the soils I've worked on in West Africa, where there is no lime, and yet they are very acid, and lime availability is a real problem in some of those regions.
Yeah.
And I think there's some evidence that indigenous farmers are producing some of these kind of darker soils and using them for producing food close to food. So I think there is, I'm not a great fan of biochar as a kind of soil improver, but I can see in certain situations where it could have a role.
Yeah, I think if it's produced locally, it can be produced in a far more low-tech, with a low-tech approach than what we showed with the gasifier. You can produce it in a very simple kiln. But yeah, I think that, at the small scale, for smallholder farmers where they can produce it kind of in situ or in the local area, then it does have potential.
Okay, great. Any other? Yes, take one. Let me give you this.
Was there any pyrolysis temperature you used, or was it just general?
It was low temperature pyrolysis, so I believe this was produced at 400 degrees from memory.